I think we all know by now that the Fujifilm X-M5 is a pretty capable video camera. It has 6K open gate recording, 4K and up to 60 frames per second in 10-bit 4:2, which are all video features that you usually get with more professional cameras. But this one is only $799, which is why I think that many beginners will use this camera to shoot their first videos with. But there are also a few serious limitations, which is why I want to make this video here where I show you how to get the most out of this camera. And I just moved to Hua Hin here, which is why I'm actually at the beach. So it's a perfect opportunity to check this camera a bit out and show you around. So now I'm vlogging on the X-M5 using the kit lens, which is a relatively good combination actually for this camera, because one of the biggest problems of the X-M5 is that there is no sensor stabilization, IBIS, but this lens, the kit lens 15 to 45 millimeter, has optical image stabilization. That's why, despite not having digital image stabilization on in camera now, I still get a relatively stable image. It's definitely not the same as having IBIS, but I think it's quite usable actually from my initial testing, so that's good. There's one thing that many people complain about when it comes to Fujifilm, and that is the autofocus, but as you can see, tracks me perfectly well. Like right now I'm using autofocus and I have face tracking on, and I also use the multi-mode, not the wide tracking, and I have face tracking only set to face tracking but not to eye tracking, and that is important from my experience with Fujifilm cameras. You don't want to have eye tracking on, you want to use face tracking in video mode. Then they're actually quite accurate. And yeah, we have the viewpoint here now. Let's have a look. So these are the autofocus settings you need to know. So again, just use face tracking without eye tracking, and ideally in multi-mode, not in wide tracking. That usually gives you better results, and that's the same for all Fujifilm cameras. So try it out. Again, I'm using that right now even with a third-party lens, the Viltrox 13mm f1.4 right now, and it should do a perfect job. So much about autofocus, but there are some more settings you should change on this camera to get the best quality, and that is that you want to shoot f-log 2. So in your menu, you want to activate f-log 2 instead of those film simulations. Now, those film simulations look great, don't get me wrong, you can do a lot of awesome stuff with it, and it's cool to have that if you want to have an image straight out of camera which just looks good and you don't have to color grade it. But if you want to color grade and if you want your videos to look as good as they can from this camera, you have to shoot f-log 2, because that gives you the maximum dynamic range, so you can see more details in the highlights and the shadows at the same time, and that is ultimately what gives it a look of a more professional camera. Essentially, this is actually the picture profile that you would use on more expensive cameras, and that's the fantastic thing about this camera, it gives you that. Aside from that, the other settings are a bit more situational. Like, I would always recommend you to shoot in 4K, because it's nearly 2025 now that I'm shooting this video. We should all shoot 4K by this time, or you can also shoot 6.2K open gate if you need a bit more room for cropping in post or for animating shots. Like, you can, for example, use 6.2K open gate to do some upwards or downwards movements or whatever you want to do. So this gives you a bit more flexibility, but you don't have to shoot that all the time. So it's more situational when it comes to those resolutions. Also, many people are a bit scared about shooting in f-log 2 because it gives you this super flat, unsaturated looking image, so it doesn't look good straight out of camera, and that's why people think you have to do a lot of color grading when it comes to that. But this is not the case today anymore. It was the case a few years ago, but today you can just go on the Fujifilm website, download the F-Log2 to Eternal LUT, for example, and apply that to your footage. That works in Final Cut, in Adobe Premiere, in DaVinci Resolve, in CapCut, in Filmora, like all major video editing apps lets you apply LUTs there. Even on an iPad, LumaFusion lets you do that. And with that LUT, you get normal, good-looking colors directly, and you can still do all your color corrections before you apply the LUTs. There you can change the exposure, the contrast, the saturation, all of that stuff, and that gives you more flexibility. Like, you get the full dynamic range of the camera, it looks much better, and you also have more options when it comes to color grading because the look is not baked into the footage. That's why I would always use that. And if you're in DaVinci Resolve, for example, it's even easier. You have DaVinci Resolve color management there, which basically just lets you tell DaVinci Resolve what picture profile you use, so F-Log2 in that case, and your colors look good pretty much instantly, and you can still do all of your color grading. I have another video about where I explain how that works in DaVinci Resolve. You can check that out. I will leave a link in the corner and also in the description below. It's actually quite easy today, and it will look so much better. But I can also recommend, if you want to get a relatively cinematic look directly, you can spend a bit of money on the Phantom LUTs from Joel Famularo, which are available for Fujifilm, Sony, and I think also Canon, Blackmagic, other cameras. So if you use those LUTs, you get this Arial Extra Cinema camera look, and that's basically what most people go for today, of course, plus some few adjustments. So with those LUTs, while they cost a bit of money, you get an even better looking image directly by shooting F-Log2. So really don't be scared of it. You can totally shoot F-Log2 even as a beginner today. It's not a problem anymore. If you don't know anything about color grading, just apply the LUT and you still get better looking footage than most YouTube videos you will see. So let's talk about lenses on the Fujifilm X-M5. There are luckily lots of lens options out there, and honestly, to get started, the kit lens is actually not bad. I started with the worst lens when I started out with different cameras many years ago, but over time you definitely want to invest in better lenses because they give you overall a much nicer, more professional and more cinematic look. That generally means the lenses are a bit sharper, they give you a nicer background blur, oftentimes also nicer sun flares and stuff like that, so you get an overall better looking image. And if you see the difference from the kit lens to actual prime lenses like I'm using right now, the Viltrox 27mm f1.2 here, for example, you will see a big difference. And to show you what I mean, let's have a quick look at a sequence that I just shot here by the beach. So there you will understand what better lenses give you. Now, unfortunately with this camera, there are a few problems when it comes to using other lenses, especially prime lenses, because most of the lenses that you can get for the Fujifilm system don't have optical image stabilization, which is usually not a problem because most Fujifilm cameras do have sensor stabilization, but the Fujifilm X-M5 does not have that. So when you want to shoot handheld with a lens and you don't have optical image stabilization in the lens itself, you usually have problems because it shakes a lot or it jitters a lot, so the footage doesn't really come out nice. To account for that, you do have digital image stabilization in the camera available, but that also gives you some problems because at first it crops in by 1.32x, which can be a problem because then your framing might get a bit too tight for vlogging, for example. I also noticed that a few lenses, such as the Viltrox 56mm f1.7, don't really seem to work with the digital image stabilization. Like, you get lots of wobble in the footage there. You can see that here in the shots. And those shots, in my opinion, they are not usable at all. Maybe that is firmware upgrade or so, that a lens like that needs it to communicate better with the camera. It could be that they come then in the future, but you have to expect that certain lenses won't work properly together with the digital image stabilization. Most do, fortunately, especially native Fuji lenses, but I also noticed that the 27mm 1.2 that I'm shooting on right now works well with digital image stabilization on this camera. Also the 13mm f1.4 from Viltrox works well with that as well, so that's good. but in my opinion, because I noticed those issues with the 56mm, you might want to get into a shop and try the lenses before you buy them, or you make use of the Amazon warranty that you have in certain countries. And another general problem with digital image stabilization on every camera is that if you want to add an ND filter to your lens to be able to use a lower shutter speed to get natural looking motion blur, you might get so-called motion artifacts in your footage. That happens because the camera shake from your hand also generates motion blur in the frame, and then when the camera compensates for the shake, it only reduces the shake, but it does not reduce the motion blur of it. It's not technically possible. So that means that you get all those motion artifacts in the shots, and that also makes your footage unusable. That's why if you want to use non-optically stabilized lenses on this camera, you either have to use with digital image stabilization at a high shutter speed if you want to shoot handheld, especially if you want to move your camera around. It's not a big issue. Many YouTubers or generally content creators do that today, especially also on Instagram, all the vertical creators. So people's eyes are used to that. So you might get away with that in the beginning, but it definitely looks more beautiful if you use an ND filter and keep the shutter speed low. Or the alternative would be to simply shoot on a tripod like I'm doing right now and what I also did in the sequence here. This is also perfectly fine. You see channels like Life of Risa, for example, where she does that a lot and they are very successful. So you can totally do that as well. I generally think right now it looks like that videos that slow you down a bit more, that others shot steadily on a tripod, actually do quite well on YouTube. Of course, you can also use a gimbal, but that in my opinion defeats the purpose of this camera, because you want to have something small with this camera, and if you then have to add a gimbal to it, you can as well just get a bigger camera instead. And also money-wise, like the gimbal adds to the money, so you might also be able to just buy a more expensive camera if you want to use that. So there you go. If you want to move around a lot with your camera, if you want to vlog or shoot handheld, then definitely invest in some OIS lenses, optically image stabilized lenses, because they work a lot better. And especially if you turn digital image stabilization on together with the optical image stabilization with those lenses, you get really nice looking smooth footage. In that case, you can also use an ND filter, because the small shake that causes the motion artifacts gets already resolved by the lens, so it's not on the sensor anymore. The sensor just does the big stuff. So that works really nice from my experience, but unfortunately there are not many optically image stabilized lenses out there. I have a few suggestions for you, of course, for both optically stabilized lenses and non-stabilized lenses. The first one is the XF10 to 24mm from Fujifilm, the ROIS, which gives you a 20mm full frame equivalent look if you turn the digital image stabilization on. So that's really nice for vlogging especially, but you don't get much background blur with this lens because it's an f4 and it's also not great for low light. And then you have the XF18 to 55mm f2.8 to 4, which is also from Fujifilm. Quite nice for general shooting. I used this lens before. Also doesn't give you a lot of background blur, but you don't get that with pretty much all of those lenses. And then you also have the XF16 to 80mm f4, which gives you a bit more zoom range, so that's quite nice for travel. And the 16mm is also relatively wide, still good enough oftentimes for landscape, and also you might be able to vlog on that, but you should walk slowly, because for that on 16mm you can't turn the digital image stabilization on again. And there's also the Tamron 17 to 70mm f2.8, which gives you a bit more background blur at 2.8, which is beautiful. I also used this lens before on other Fujifilm bodies, and this lens has VC, which means that it's optically stabilized. It's called vibration compensation on this lens. That's good as well, but this lens is pretty big. It's a bit too big for that body. Of course you can use it, but it defeats a bit the purpose of the X-M5 if you want to go for a small camera. And when it comes to non-stabilized lenses, you have the Viltrox 27mm f1.2, what I've been shooting sequence partly on before. A really beautiful lens, is my favorite APS-C lens. Then you also have the Viltrox 13mm f1.4 lens. That's what I'm shooting on right now. Nice for shots like that here where you want to be a bit closer to the camera.
And you also have the Wilcox 35mm f1.7 and 56mm 1.7 lenses. I did not use the 35mm lens, but it looks very similar to the 56. So you might get issues with the digital image stabilization on both of those lenses. That's why it's only half recommended for this camera. But for all your static shots, it's actually really beautiful. I also used the 56mm f1.7 before in the sequence by the beach. And there's also the Fujifilm 23mm f2, which is nice and small and gives you good background separation, native from Fujifilm, so a great option for this camera. And you also have the Tamron 11 to 20mm f2.8, which gives you a 22mm full frame equivalent field of view if you use it with the digital image stabilization. So that's also a nice lens for vlogging on this camera. But there, because there is no optical image stabilization, you can't or you shouldn't use ND filters with this lens, at least not when you vlog, when you move the camera around. If you shoot on a tripod, of course, you can also do that with all of those lenses. So much about lenses. I know that was a lot, but it's an important topic because lenses do make a bigger difference in the camera, at least if you have a camera that shoots log footage in 10-bit like the X-M5 does. But there's also another important factor, and that is lighting. Let's come to that next. So lighting, I will make that short because there is a lot that goes into lighting, so it's better to watch some more in-depth tutorials about that. But generally lighting is important because if whatever is in front of your camera looks bad, there is not much you can do in post. Of course, you can do a bit of color grading or so to make something pop or so, but it's not that much that you can do. The more you can nail it in camera, the better it is, and that usually means that you want to have good lighting, you want to use a good lens, and then framing and composition and stuff. And lighting generally, if you want to shoot outside, if you want to use natural lighting, then you either want to go out for a sunrise or sunset, because the sun is low, you get this nice golden light effect, which makes everything look really nice. And it's also a bit easier to achieve certain techniques like backlighting and side lighting because the sun is so low. And these are techniques that you generally want to use if you light your videos. You either want the light source to be somewhere behind your subject to give it more depth, because then you get this rim light around your subject, what separates it from the background, or you want the light to come from the side because that throws shadows over the subject, what also gives it more depth. So overall, lighting is about creating depth in your scene. And I made a more in-depth tutorial about natural lighting, which I will link here in the corner. You can check that out. I will also link it in the description in case the link here shouldn't appear. That happens sometimes. But let's also come to a conclusion about this camera now. And I made a test shot here with the X-M5 versus my Sony A9 Mark III, which costs $6,500. And I want to know if you can tell a difference in both shots. So I will show them to you now, and you let me know in the comments which one is which. So I'm really curious about what you think, because I just find it insane what you can do with a small cheap camera such as the X-M5 if you use a good lens on it. Just comes so close to super expensive cameras. It's wild. And yeah, if you want to learn more about videography and how to get your shots to look as good as that, then check out this video here in the corner. There you will learn more. It's a complete 30 minutes guide about videography. So there you learn basically everything you really need to know to get started. I see you there. Hey.